Chapter 27. The Violin. "Your violin is ready, Mr. Gaspar." It seemed strange to hear the luthier address him so formally again, and Richard simply replied, "Thank you," before hanging up the phone. He packed his belongings and checked every square inch of the hotel room to make sure that he was not leaving anything behind. He folded up his music stand and put the sheet music into the zippered cover of his case. As he lifted the handle, he thought, "I'm ready." Since the day he had talked with Cheryl, he had done a lot of thinking. He realized there is more to life than just what we see around us, and somehow God will make it right in the end. While his violin's varnish had been drying, he also thought of the luthier's craft, the ability to take trees that had been dead for ages and seemingly bring them back to life. He then thought of himself and the good that he could accomplish using his talents to make the world a better place, just like Michelle had done for him with her life. He felt as though he had slowly regained his heart while practicing and dedicating each new song to Michelle. He also found that he only dreamed of the good things now, the fun times they had, and especially their first kiss. With no more nightmares to torment him, and having found someone who could sympathize with his suffering, it was as though Richard's mind had been freed of all regrets. He could finally move on with his life, emotionally as well as professionally. Richard grabbed the handle of his case and carried it toward the door. "I know who I am. I am Richard Gaspar, and I can live with that now." After swinging the door open, he held up both hands and looked at them. There is more to us than just this physical body, and somehow, someday, I will see Michelle smiling and running, and we will be together again. Until that day, I will live my life to make her happy, and I will make her proud. Richard loaded his belongings into the Blazer and drove up the freeway with a smile of contentment. He wasn't worried about the violin. Maybe, he thought, the instrument really doesn't matter. He had noticed over the previous 2 weeks that his Bergonzi had improved just as much as his outlook on life had, and he was playing better than he had ever played before. He had even made plans to set the stage in a way that could be acceptable to the critics while also thrilling the audience. By the time he pulled onto the main street of Leeds, he felt like he was ready to take on the world. Even if the violin isn't as good as the Guarnerius in New York, it's all been worth it. 2 years in the asylum and $100,000 for therapy never made me feel like this. Suddenly it struck Richard. The luthier had never told him the third secret. It was only then that Richard realized that he needed something more. The notes the luthier had played were different. Even with the stage set, the music was special, somehow magical, and Richard knew it. Terror seized Richard, and he began to panic. "No, I still don't play like the luthier, let alone Paganini." He knew that he was good, but when he stopped and compared himself to his dreams of Paganini, or even to the luthier, he knew he still fell short. And yet, the luthier said that I could play better than he. What is the last secret? Will he tell it to me now? Richard tried to calm his emotions while pulling on to the old gravel road. He spoke out loud to his violin case containing the Bergonzi. "What's the last secret? What do we lack, old girl?" He was still wondering after coming to a stop in front of the violin shop. He must tell me. I have to know, he thought while lifting his violin from the back seat and almost jogging toward the door. What will he be like today? Richard wondered, while remembering Mr. Haito's angry face before he saw the swords. Whatever he does, I'm going to remain calm. I want that last secret." As calmly as he could, Richard opened the door and walked in. "Good afternoon, Richard." "Good afternoon, Luthier," Richard replied with a sincere smile. He shook the Luthier's hand. The Luthier wasted no time and gestured him toward the bench. The case was dark blue and trimmed with sterling silver latches and hinges. It was similar to the light blue case Circe had bought, only his had more flair and sophistication. "How does it sound? Is it louder, fuller, sweeter?" After a pause, Richard added, "Is it what I need?" "I don't know how it sounds," replied the Luthier. "I haven't played it." "Then how do you know if it's any good?" "Because you are ready, and it is what you need," answered the Luthier. "You would always regret this day if I, or anyone else, played upon this instrument before you. And before you touch the latches, you must promise me that no one else will ever play upon this violin but you, for as long as you live." Richard knew the story well. In 1802, Paganini was 20 years old and had an addiction to gambling. He had gambled away his Amati the afternoon of an important concert, then frantically inquired all over town for a violin that he could borrow for the evening's performance. He finally found a businessman from Livorno who possessed a fine Joseph Guarnerius. Paganini was allowed to borrow it, but only on the strict conditions that the owner be given the front center seat during the concert, and after the performance, the instrument was to be handed directly back to him as soon as the last note had been played. Paganini agreed to all of the conditions, and the concert went on as planned. It was said that no performance had ever had such life and expression before, that every member of the audience experienced feelings they had never thought possible and were brought groveling under his feet the entire time he played upon the Guarnerius. When the concert was over, Paganini walked to the front of the stage, and the owner refused it, declaring, "Never shall any other hands defile this instrument. It is yours, if you will promise that no mere mortal shall ever play upon it again." Paganini promised that no one else would ever play the violin, and the ownership was passed to him while he was still standing on stage. It was Paganini's solo instrument from that night until his death 38 years later. His will bequeathed it to the city of his birth on the condition that it never be played again. Richard had never understood the reason for Paganini making the promise, yet he felt that he would as soon as he played upon the instrument the luthier had made for him. "No one else will ever play this violin," Richard promised. Then he turned toward the case and opened it. Richard's eyes were immediately drawn to the lid. Embedded in the top of the dark Prussian blue interior were bright, shiny buffalo nickels, like sparkling stars in the night sky. Tears blurred Richard's vision as he thought of Michelle and the night they gave each other everything. Cradled below in the soft dark blue velvet was the most beautiful golden brown violin he had ever seen. The luthier smiled, then quietly walked across the entry, sat down, and closed his eyes. Richard's hands trembled as he lifted the violin from its case, and the varnish burst to life when the light shone directly upon it. He turned it over, already knowing that the flames in the maple would get narrower at the waist. He moved it back and forth under the small chandelier, and the colors changed, just like Michelle's hair, from sunlight to moonlight. He whispered toward the luthier, "Thank you." A smile and a nod were the luthier's only reply. Richard lifted the violin and instinctively reached for a tuning peg. He immediately felt Michelle's hand in his, and he flinched. Yet he didn't let go, because her fingers were so soft and familiar. "If this is a dream, I refuse to ever wake up." He lifted the bow and smiled again. Engraved on each side of the ebony frog was a tree, just like the two they had sat between when they were young. Richard no longer questioned, he believed, and after tightening the hair, he began to play. With the very first note, Michelle stood before him. She smiled and looked lovingly into his eyes. She was wearing the same summer dress she wore when they first kissed. He closed his eyes and continued playing while she walked toward him and pressed her lips against his. She moved her head slowly and lovingly from one side to the other as her mouth caressed his, and when Richard drew the bow lightly, he felt her breath against his cheek. It had been so long. He savored every note of the mellow passage, and she slowly pressed against him. When Richard put extra pressure on the bow, she kissed him hard. As the music began to move, she stepped back and danced in a way that made Richard realize that she was no longer a teenage girl. When the tempo raced, she threw out her arms and spun around with her hair flying through the air. It made a breeze that Richard could feel swirling around him from every direction. He played the flying spiccato, and she appeared in a Spanish dress and tapped her heels sharply on the floor, following his every note to perfection. On and on he played, knowing that the music flowing from the violin had something more than any other instrument he had ever played. Richard couldn't help himself. He began playing a mournful song, and tears of joy filled their eyes while they experienced all of their lonely memories of the past, because now they were just memories. He then played each of her favorite songs as the time drifted effortlessly away. Richard had no idea how long he had been playing, but he couldn't stop because there were so many things to experience with Michelle. Yet he knew that it was getting late, and he realized that one more song would have to do. So he brought the tempo up to moderato and the volume to mezzo piano, and they talked. "It's been so long." "Yes," Michelle answered. "I've missed you." "Where have you been all of these years?" Richard asked while looking into her soft brown eyes. "Waiting for you." "Will you be mine forever?" he asked. "I always have been, and I always will. You only needed to believe." Michelle kissed Richard goodbye as the song ended, and he lowered the violin. Richard reopened his eyes and faced the luthier. "Master Luthier, I believe I know what the last secret is." The luthier looked up. "Go on." "True love." The luthier smiled knowingly. "Yes, it is, and it always will be." Contentment filled Richard's soul as he admired everything about the instrument and thought of the words that Cheryl had spoken on the porch. They had given him so much hope, and now he wondered if the luthier had anything more to add. "When I die?" "She will be there, waiting for you," the luthier replied. "And until then?" Richard asked, still not sure if Michelle would be with him only that once, or if she would appear every time he played the violin. "Never let her memory die. It is completely your choice what happens when you play. It is up to you." Richard gently lowered the violin into its case and noticed the birthmark again. It was still visible through the varnish. It made him realize what had really just happened. Not only that day, but over the previous 6 weeks. He had seen and heard so many things that no one else could ever believe, and yet he believed them all. Richard knew that it was time for him to leave and continue on with his life, but he couldn't until he had the answer to one last question. Master Luthier, where did you get the 2 trees to make this violin? The luthier smiled, with tears glistening in his eyes. A dear friend of mine called when he heard that they were going to chop down 2 trees in his small town to make room for a playground. Tears welled in Richard's eyes while the luthier continued. This man had helped me search for violin wood in Canada when I first began my collection, and he insisted that these 2 trees were more special than all of the others, and that I had to make a violin from them someday. He met me at the park, and even though he was 90 years old at the time, he cut and split the 2 trees himself. He said that he had to, because he was doing it for a friend. He died just a few days later, and the wood has hung from my ceiling ever since. What was his name? Richard asked, already knowing the answer. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, and the great Richard Gaspar, who had learned to stifle and hide his feelings his entire life, had no desire to hold them back now. While he waited for the luthier's reply, Richard closed his eyes and pictured an old gray-haired man wearing a plaid shirt, suspenders, and green pants. His name was Verl Edwards, replied the luthier. Richard finally understood the dreams that had made no sense to him before. One of them was of an old man walking away from the park. It ended with him leaning on an old twisted cane and looking back at where the 2 trees had once stood with a smile of contentment. Richard fastened the latches on the case and pulled out his checkbook. He lifted the pen that he always signed his autographs with, then wrote the date and signed his name. How much do I owe you? 35,000, as we agreed, replied the luthier with a smile and a graceful bow. I can never thank you enough, Richard commented while filling in the numbers and placing it on the table. He silently opened the door and walked away. The luthier didn't even glance at the check. Instead, he looked at all of the other pieces of wood hanging from his ceiling with a faraway look in his eyes. As Richard's car pulled away, the luthier walked to the counter and solemnly placed the check in his cash drawer. Just before the drawer slid shut, he looked down and smiled. It read, "Pay to the order of Sean Diego Luthier, $70,000. $70,000 and no cents. $35,000 for a violin, plus tip. Signed, Richard Gaspar."